They showed up at my door with letters, threats, and demands I couldn't ignore. HOA Karen claimed my workshop was a nuisance, a violation, a danger to the community, but she had no idea what I really did there. I spent years building equipment, tools, and technology that helped protect people who risked their lives every day. And now, she thought she could shut it all down with a few scribbled rules and empty threats. What happens when a petty neighbor goes after something bigger than she can even imagine? Oakwood Heights was the kind of neighborhood that looked perfect in brochures. Wide streets lined with freshly painted houses, neatly trimmed hedges, and the faint scent of jasmine drifting from front gardens. Life here was quiet, almost comforting in its routine. I had moved in a few years ago, drawn to the calm, the sense of safety, and the space to build something of my own. My workshop sat at the back of the property. A modest but well-equipped space where I spent hours designing, constructing, and testing equipment that was sometimes ordinary, sometimes specialized, and sometimes critical for professionals who depended on it. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like just another garage or hobby shed. I loved that it blended in, keeping my passion private but purposeful. Weekdays were spent on projects, tinkering with parts, welding, and assembling tools that were often shipped to police departments and safety agencies across the state. I prided myself on the work, knowing that every piece of equipment I built could make a difference in someone's life. Neighbors were friendly enough at first, exchanging waves or nods when we crossed paths. Life seemed routine, almost predictable, until the first HOA notice arrived. At first, it was a polite letter, hinting that the workshop might not comply with community aesthetic standards. I brushed it off, thinking it was a misunderstanding. But over time, the notices grew sharper, more insistent, and increasingly invasive. It was as if someone had decided my quiet, lawful work was a threat to the neighborhood, even though the only thing dangerous about it was the potential to stir petty outrage. Little did I know, the letter was just the beginning. Behind the polite language and formal headers lurked a neighbor who thrived on control. A woman who would become known in whispers as HOA Karen. She had her eyes on my property, my workshop, and eventually, she would push so far that she would set in motion a conflict neither of us could have anticipated. And so, what had begun as a quiet life of creation and purpose was about to collide with the absurd authority of bureaucracy, ego, and petty jealousy. The first letter was polite, almost cordial, tucked neatly into my mailbox with a stamped HOA envelope. "Why have noticed that your workshop may not comply with community standards," it read. At first, I thought it was a simple misunderstanding. Oakwood Heights prided itself on its manicured lawns and uniform aesthetics, but my workshop was tucked out of sight behind the house, barely noticeable. I replied with a brief note explaining its purpose. A personal workspace for building equipment I supplied to police departments and safety organizations. Surely, that would settle the matter. It didn't. Days later, another letter arrived, sharper this time. It cited aesthetic concerns and demanded I remove certain equipment from view, impose stricter organization, and schedule an inspection at the HOA's convenience. I complied, reorganized the yard, adjusted fences, and ensured nothing looked out of place. Still, the notices kept coming. Then came the fines. Small at first, $25 for a supposed violation of workshop placement. I paid them, hoping it would end, but soon they escalated $50, $75, $100. Each fine arrived with a carefully worded note implying that continued violations would result in liens or legal action. What began as a polite request had morphed into a relentless campaign. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. I was being penalized not for noise, safety, or disturbance, but for existing within the property lines I owned, pursuing work that served the public. Neighbors started whispering. At first, it was subtle, a glance here, a curious question there. But soon, a few even crossed the line, warning me that the HOA was serious about compliance. And that defiance would only make things worse. One afternoon, as I was unloading materials, a neighbor lingered by the street, leaning against a tree with a faint smirk. "Better watch out," they said. "HOA Karen doesn't like troublemakers." I didn't respond, but the words lingered in the air. An invisible pressure pressing down on every hour I spent in my workshop. I tried reasoning with the board, sending emails detailing my work's legality and importance, emphasizing the public safety applications of my equipment. Some devices were used for training, others for protective gear. Tools that literally helped keep officers and communities safe. Yet every response was a form letter, carefully neutral, refusing to address any substantive points. Their focus was not safety or legality. It was control, and they wielded it ruthlessly. Inspections began shortly after. HOA representatives arrived with clipboards, cameras, and measuring tapes. Every bolt, shelf, and exterior wall was scrutinized. I could feel their eyes on every corner, every box, every piece of equipment. Even after showing permits and explaining my work's purpose, they persisted, asking increasingly invasive questions. My property was private, yet I felt exposed, as though every decision I made, every angle of the fence, every placement of tools, was under a microscope designed to intimidate. The harassment escalated further. Notices were taped to my front door, slipped under the workshop side gate, even sent electronically with read receipts, to ensure I couldn't ignore them. Some letters suggested I might face criminal implications if non-compliance continued. Others warned of community unrest, implying that neighbors were being disturbed by the mere existence of my workshop. The absurdity was maddening. My workspace caused no noise, no traffic, no hazard, only attention from someone determined to enforce rules that had no basis beyond ego. Weeks passed, and the conflict began affecting daily life. Suppliers hesitated before delivering materials. Couriers asked questions about permissions. Even friends visiting were wary of crossing property lines too closely. The neighborhood that had once felt safe and familiar now seemed tense and judgmental. It wasn't the workshop itself that bothered me. It was the siege mentality the HOA had imposed. Every knock on the door felt like an ambush. Every letter felt like a demand for surrender. Then came the notice for the formal HOA hearing. This was the next stage, a meeting in front of the entire board, scheduled to determine my compliance, or lack thereof. The letter was polite enough in tone, but the implication was clear: failure to comply in this public forum could result in maximum fines, liens, or even court action. I read it several times, each pass deepening the knot of anticipation in my chest. My grandfather, who had quietly observed the escalating conflict, looked at me and simply said, "Let them come." In the lead up to the hearing, tension reached a new level. Notices listed obscure rules I had never heard of. Some written decades ago, others seemingly invented overnight. One letter demanded that no equipment be visible from the street. Another suggested that my workshop's roof color violated community standards. I spent hours combing through HOA guidelines, trying to anticipate their next move, only to find that the rules themselves were vague, contradictory, and weaponized to frustrate. Neighbors began taking sides. Some avoided me entirely, fearful of being associated with a troublemaker. Others whispered encouragement, urging me to hold my ground. The atmosphere in Oakwood Heights became charged, as though everyone was waiting for an inevitable confrontation. Even the local mail carrier seemed to deliver letters with extra care, perhaps sensing the tension that hung thick in the air. The days leading up to the hearing were filled with constant mental strain. I double-checked permits, inventory lists, and equipment documentation. I reviewed correspondence with the HOA repeatedly, ensuring nothing could be used against me. Every evening, I sat in the workshop, surrounded by tools and materials, feeling the weight of countless eyes upon me. It was exhausting, frustrating, and yet strangely motivating. Every letter, every inspection, every petty fine only strengthened my resolve. And then came the first hint that this battle might be more complicated than I expected. A neighbor, normally quiet and distant, stopped by to mention, almost casually, that HOA Karen had been asking about the equipment itself. What it was used for, who it was sold to, how it functioned. She was no longer content to regulate aesthetics, now she was probing the purpose and legality of my work, unaware that the tools I built were not only legal, but critical to police safety and public protection. The realization hit me. This wasn't about appearance anymore. She had crossed into territory she didn't understand, and the consequences of her ignorance were about to become visible. As the day of the hearing approached, the tension was palpable. The neighborhood seemed to hold its collective breath. Deliveries were timed, fences adjusted, and every inch of the workshop checked for compliance. I knew the HOA would arrive ready to assert authority, eager to humiliate or intimidate. But I also knew that their power had limits, especially against someone prepared, documented, and legally protected. My grandfather, who had spent hours quietly inspecting the property, seemed to sense the approaching storm. He didn't speak, but his calm presence reminded me that we were ready, that every challenge thrown at us had only made us stronger. The stage was set. Oakwood Heights, once a quiet suburban enclave, had become a pressure cooker. Each inspection, each letter, each neighborly glance had compounded into a single, inevitable confrontation. The HOA's arrogance, built on petty rules and imagined authority, was about to collide with reality, a reality they were unprepared for. And while I didn't yet know the exact moment when the balance would shift, I could feel it building, an unstoppable tension that promised to explode the moment the hearing began. It was clear this wasn't going to end quietly. The petty rules, the endless fines, the inspections and threats, they had all been leading to this. The HOA had created a storm they couldn't control, and my workshop, my work, and my resolve were at the center of it. And in the back of my mind, I realized once the hearing started, nothing would ever be the same again. The morning of the HOA hearing arrived with an almost surreal stillness. Oakwood Heights, usually humming with routine activity, felt charged, as if the neighborhood itself knew that something extraordinary was about to unfold. I walked up the driveway with my grandfather beside me, the workshop looming behind, like a silent testament to years of work, dedication, and quiet defiance. Every step toward the clubhouse carried a weight I could feel in my chest. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, some with curiosity, others with a hint of apprehension, as if aware that civility and ego were about to collide in a very public way. Inside the clubhouse, the board members were already assembled, faces set in rehearsed professionalism. Their clipboards and legal pads were ready, their eyes sharp and calculating, a mix of authority and impatience. At the head of the table, HOA Karen's gaze swept the room. finally resting on me with a smirk that spoke of self-assured dominance. She believed she controlled the narrative, that she could publicly shame me, intimidate me, and force compliance with the wave of a pen. She didn't know, and I didn't need to tell her, that the real leverage wasn't in ink or procedure. It was in what the workshop represented. The meeting began predictably, with Karen reading aloud every regulation, guideline, and obscure rule she could muster against me. She spoke of community standards, nuisance concerns, and potential disruptions, carefully choosing language that sounded polite but carried an unmistakable threat. One board member chimed in about precedents for enforcement, while another took notes with an expression that tried, and failed, to hide disdain. I listened, calm and collected, letting every word wash over me. I had prepared for this. Every inspection, every letter, every petty fine had been leading to this exact moment. When they finally asked for my response, I stood. I didn't speak first. I let the room feel the silence, letting it stretch, making the tension almost unbearable. Then I began, slowly, deliberately, explaining the purpose of my work. The equipment built in that very workshop was not hobbyist tinkering. It was professional, grade gear, used by law enforcement for training, safety, and critical operations. I described the process carefully, emphasizing legality, safety, and accountability. I laid out permits, documentation, and certifications, showing that everything in the workshop was above board. The room reacted differently than I expected. Murmurs rippled among the board members. Karen's smirk faltered. She had expected defiance, excuses, or guilt, but not proof that my work was lawful, essential, and respected outside the narrow confines of their petty rules. My grandfather leaned back, calm as ever, the faintest hint of a smile crossing his face. I knew that the tide had begun to turn, even if Karen hadn't realized it yet. And then, it happened. The unmistakable rumble of an engine reached the windows. Heads turned, necks craned. Outside the clubhouse, in the parking area, sat a large delivery truck, conspicuously marked with law enforcement insignia. Behind it, a vehicle trailer gleamed in the morning light, carrying several pieces of the very equipment Karen had tried to declare a nuisance. Every board member froze, realizing that this wasn't just a private workshop. This was a facility whose work was trusted, relied upon, and even essential to people risking their lives daily. Karen's face went pale. Her carefully rehearsed authority faltered, replaced by panic. She tried to regain composure, stammering through phrases about procedure and compliance, but her words were hollow against the reality she now faced. The proof was right there, visible, undeniable. I had anticipated this escalation. I had documented everything, built credibility, and prepared for exactly the moment when evidence would speak louder than bureaucracy. The board members whispered frantically among themselves, realizing that their position was no longer secure. Some attempted to continue reading regulations aloud, but the words seemed meaningless. The community around us, peeking through windows and doors, was now aware that the rules Karen wielded as weapons had no weight against legal, safe, and essential work. Even a few neighbors, previously hesitant or supportive of Karen's control, began to shift subtly, their expressions showing a dawning understanding. The workshop was not a threat, it was a contribution to society, and the HOA had misjudged the situation entirely. Then my grandfather, usually silent in these moments, stepped forward. His voice, calm but resonant, carried authority born from years of experience and quiet confidence. All of this is legal. All of this is necessary. You have no authority here to stop what is lawful, and you have no understanding of the consequences of interfering with it. His words cut through the tension like a blade. The room was silent, every board member frozen in a moment of disbelief. Karen tried to respond, but no words came. The bluff had been called, and it had failed. I continued, emphasizing the human impact. I described officers who relied on my equipment, who trusted every piece of gear built in that very workshop. I spoke of safety, responsibility, and dedication. I spoke not just as a homeowner defending property, but as someone defending the value and integrity of my work. Each sentence landed with weight, each fact a hammer against the fragile authority Karen had tried to wield. The narrative shifted, subtly at first, then unmistakably. The HOA was no longer in control. I was. And then, the final coup, I invited representatives to inspect the equipment themselves, to see firsthand the legality, safety, and professionalism of every piece. Karen hesitated, caught between asserting authority and exposing her ignorance. The board members were flustered, realizing that any attempt to discredit me now would only highlight their overreach and lack of knowledge. It was a moment of public reckoning. Authority had been challenged, and for the first time, the facade cracked. As the inspection began, the tension in the room transformed from intimidation to awe. The board members walked past tables of tools, machinery, and safety devices, all meticulously labeled and documented. They measured, touched, and examined, unable to find fault. The absurdity of previous threats, letters, fines, and warnings became painfully clear. Every piece of paper, every petty complaint, every attempt to harass or intimidate was exposed as baseless and trivial. Karen's frustration grew palpable. She shifted in her seat, glanced around for allies, but found none. Even her most loyal board supporters looked uncertain, their confidence shaken by the undeniable reality. The room, once a theater of control, had become a courtroom of truth. And the truth was that I had been right, lawful, and unwavering all along. By the time the meeting concluded, Karen was silent, defeated, and visibly humiliated. The board offered no further fines, no additional threats, and no enforcement action. Their authority, so carefully constructed over years of petty rule enforcement, had collapsed under evidence, preparation, and principle. I had not only defended my property and workshop, but had delivered a decisive lesson in accountability, integrity, and courage. As we left the clubhouse, neighbors approached cautiously, some with admiration, others with surprise. A few murmured apologies for ever doubting me. Many simply nodded in recognition of what had just occurred. A community had witnessed the audacity of a petty authority being confronted with truth and preparation. Outside, my grandfather stood by the workshop, silent but proud, a quiet testament to the fact that experience, strategy, and calm resolve could overcome even the most arrogant opposition. That day, Oakwood Heights learned a lesson it would not forget. Rules could not be enforced without reason. Authority could not intimidate without knowledge, and no amount of petty ego could overcome preparation, legality, and principle. Karen had tried to crush my workshop, but in doing so, she exposed her own limitations and inadvertently showcased the resilience, strategy, and quiet power of the homeowner she had underestimated. And yet, even in victory, there was a lingering question: if such arbitrary power could be wielded so recklessly once, who else might be next? Who else might face baseless threats, fines, or intimidation? The answer remained uncertain. But one thing was clear: standing firm, armed with truth, integrity, and preparation, was the only way to ensure that justice, respect, and common sense could prevail. The day after the HOA hearing, Oakwood Heights felt like a neighborhood transformed. The streets that had once seemed so rigid, so quiet in their polished uniformity, now carried a subtle air of anticipation. Neighbors peeked over fences, exchanged quiet words, and approached my driveway with cautious curiosity. It was as if the previous tension, the fear, the whispered warnings, and the petty surveillance had been replaced by a new awareness. Something significant had happened. Something everyone, whether they admitted it or not, had witnessed. Inside, my grandfather moved with the same calm precision he always had. He checked the workshop, adjusted equipment, and reviewed documentation, all with quiet confidence. He never boasted or drew attention to his presence. Yet it was clear that his involvement had been crucial. The gravity of the previous day's confrontation, the scrutiny, the intimidation, the eventual unraveling of HOA Karen's authority, had been softened by his calm, measured guidance. The workshop was intact, the equipment secure, and the validation of our efforts undeniable. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the neighborhood. Those who had once whispered complaints and sided with Karen began approaching, cautiously at first, and then more openly. "I didn't realize," one neighbor admitted, eyes wide, "how much you do, and how important it is." Another nodded quietly, saying simply, "You were right all along." The atmosphere shifted from suspicion to a tentative respect. The community had seen not only the absurdity of petty authority, but also the power of preparation, legality, and calm, unwavering resolve. The HOA board, meanwhile, was forced to reckon with its own overreach. Letters were quietly rescinded, fines withdrawn, and meetings postponed indefinitely. Attempts to assert authority in the past manner were no longer viable. The spectacle of the evidence, the professionalism of the work, and the undeniable legality of my operations had dismantled their position entirely. Karen's usual confidence was gone, replaced by visible frustration and quiet humiliation. Her power, derived from the fear of enforcement, had collapsed under the weight of reality and principle. In the weeks that followed, Oakwood Heights returned to a semblance of normalcy. But nothing felt quite the same. Children played freely in the streets, without the shadow of petty rules hanging over them. Neighbors engaged in conversations about fairness, responsibility, and the importance of knowing the limits of authority. Some apologized for their previous compliance, others for remaining silent, but all seemed to grasp a new understanding. Power untempered by reason and fairness is fragile, and the consequences of abusing it are visible to everyone. The workshop continued to operate without interference, and I noticed subtle changes in my interactions with the neighborhood. Couriers delivered without hesitation, suppliers no longer questioned permissions, and even casual acquaintances who once avoided engagement now nodded with quiet acknowledgement of what had transpired. Oakwood Heights had been altered, not through confrontation alone, but through the demonstration of knowledge, preparation, and unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The impact extended beyond the immediate neighborhood. Social media posts, shared videos, and discussions on community forums amplified the events, framing the story as a lesson in resilience and integrity. People debated the overreach of HOA authority, admired the preparation and courage demonstrated, and shared their own experiences of bureaucracy gone too far. The narrative resonated far beyond the confines of Oakwood Heights, sparking conversations about accountability, civic responsibility, and the power of standing firm against arbitrary rules. Even the local press picked up the story. Articles highlighted the professionalism of the workshop, the legality of the equipment, and the dramatic clash with HOA Karen. They praised the calm, measured approach, framing it as a lesson in handling disputes with dignity and strategic foresight. Headlines emphasized the absurdity of the attempt to shut down essential, lawful work, but also the triumph of principle and perseverance. The story became not just about a neighborhood conflict, but a broader lesson in how ordinary people can defend themselves against arbitrary authority when prepared and principled. On a personal level, the experience left an indelible mark. The daily stress, the constant scrutiny, and the feeling of being under siege had been exhausting, but they had also been transformative. I developed a renewed confidence in my ability to confront challenges, no matter how entrenched the opposition. I learned that preparation, documentation, and an unwavering commitment to legality and principle are the most powerful tools anyone can wield. More importantly, I learned the value of legacy. The quiet wisdom and support of my grandfather had amplified my efforts, turning a potentially overwhelming conflict into a decisive victory. The HOA, having been publicly humbled, gradually shifted its approach. Board members began communicating with a bit more respect and caution, perhaps wary of the consequences of overreach. Letters became less threatening, meetings less formal, and fines were never imposed again. The culture of intimidation that had once defined Oakwood Heights eroded, replaced by a cautious understanding that authority must be exercised with fairness and knowledge. The subtle but profound change in the neighborhood culture was palpable. Residents felt freer, more respected, and more empowered to protect their rights. Neighbors who had once avoided me began to engage in genuine dialogue. They asked questions about the equipment, expressed curiosity about the work, and sometimes sought advice for their own projects. A sense of mutual respect began to replace fear and suspicion. It became clear that our conflict had sparked a broader awareness of civic responsibility, personal boundaries, and the limits of institutional authority. The workshop, once a source of contention, had become a symbol of diligence, skill, and principled action. Looking back, the confrontation over a single workshop revealed larger truths about power, control, and integrity. Systems of authority often rely on fear, compliance, and silence. But when individuals choose to stand firmly, armed with preparation, evidence, and moral clarity, even the most entrenched power structures can be challenged. The experience reinforced the importance of courage, patience, and strategic thinking. It was a reminder that standing up for what is right is rarely easy, but it is always worth it. Even Oakwood Heights, with its polished streets and manicured lawns, became a testament to that lesson. The story of the confrontation, the dramatic evidence, and the ultimate vindication circulated quietly among neighbors, shaping the community's understanding of fairness and accountability. Residents now understood that rules were not absolute, they could be questioned, challenged, and, when necessary, confronted. The HOA, once feared, had been rendered cautious, reminding everyone that unchecked authority carries consequences. On a more personal level, the ordeal strengthened my resolve and my understanding of responsibility. I recognized that preparation and principle are inseparable. Knowledge without courage accomplishes little, and courage without evidence or legality can backfire. Together, they form a shield against intimidation and a foundation for meaningful action. The workshop, which had once been a private sanctuary, became a quiet monument to that principle. Proof that perseverance, clarity, and integrity could overcome even relentless, petty opposition. Months later, the neighborhood seemed almost serene. The streets carried a sense of cautious optimism. Children played freely. Neighbors conversed more openly, and the aura of petty fear had vanished. Yet beneath the surface, the lessons lingered. People were now aware that authority must be exercised responsibly, that challenges must be met with preparation, and that standing firm in the face of absurdity is not only possible, but necessary. The story of the HOA dispute became more than a tale of bureaucracy gone awry. It became a lesson in life, in resilience, and in courage. Oakwood Heights had witnessed firsthand the consequences of overreach and the power of reasoned, lawful, and determined resistance. The victory was not merely personal, it was communal, moral, and enduring. And as I returned to the workshop, tools in hand, the morning light casting long shadows over the neatly arranged equipment, I understood something fundamental. Conflict may come unexpectedly, authority may challenge you unfairly, and bureaucracy may attempt to suppress what is right. But when truth, preparation, and integrity are on your side, even the most oppressive forces can be confronted and overcome. So the workshop remained a beacon of perseverance and purpose. The neighborhood learned, the HOA recalibrated, and I carried forward the knowledge that standing firm is not just an act of defiance. It is an act of courage, responsibility, and ultimately, transformation. As the sun dipped behind the oakwood trees, casting golden light over the quiet streets, I couldn't help but wonder how many others would need to learn this lesson, and who else would be inspired to stand firm, armed with knowledge, principle, and unwavering resolve.